Hey, Rob, how you doing?
Good.
We are delighted to have so many people here. I want to welcome you. I'm Lyle Hanna, chair Kentucky Habitat, and I've been doing Habitat for many, many years. Fortunate enough to serve as the vice chair of the international board at one point and the chair of the Global Leadership Council. And Ali, um, I like thinking big, making dreams and making them happen, and that's what today's all about. We're really excited to have everybody on board for this Zoom on affordable housing and health equity. We are going to tape this program, so we'll be making it available, I imagine, as early as tomorrow. If anybody misses it or there's just something you want to go back and watch, don't. We'll have a copy of it so that you can take a look at it and share it with others. Also, want you to feel free to ask questions. So let's keep this casual. Let's make it fun. Dr. T is awesome, and she's open to responding to questions. But put them down in the chat box. If you just can't stand it, speak up. Take your mute off and speak up. Is that okay, Dr. T?
That's perfect.
All right. So, you know what? We've got some great hosts on the line that helped pull this off. Colleen Dudley from Tennessee. We've got the state support organizations that are putting this on today. So, Colleen's from the Tennessee State Organization. Jen Electrock from Indiana is on here, and we're excited about partnering with them on our conference coming up this next year, and just delighted to have Jenny, you on this call, and Ryan Miller from Ohio. So they've helped us pull this off, but also Adrian Bush, and not all of you know her, but she is the executive director of the Homeless and Housing Coalition in Kentucky, and she's been a terrific partner for Kentucky Habitat, and we love being able to reach out to her and include her in things, and she's got a great following, so we're glad she's on here too. Now, today is all about thinking beyond the moment, thinking out in the future. How do we make what we're challenged to do even bigger and better and attract more people, inspire more people? And how do we improve our communities? Oh my gosh, the challenge for decent housing, we've made some pretty good progress in Habitat over the years. We're building a ton of houses and repairing a ton of houses, but this COVID thing has set us back some. So our numbers are down, and the need is even greater than ever. In fact, people are realizing now more than ever how important it is to have a home. That's where that's where you stay safe. That's where you go when you want to seclude yourself off and not be around others. There's so many reasons it's become so important. So the need for us to do better, to be more inspiring, to get more done is greater than ever. So we have invited Miss Inspiration, Dr. T, to join us today, Dr. Tiffany Manuel. She is a dynamic speaker. She's a best-selling author. Come on. We're just lucky to have her here today. She's president and CEO of the CaseMade, and she works with hundreds of people across the country to help them be passionate about what they're doing to make social change. And so she's going to share with us some of her inspiring thoughts and stories, and I think what we need to do is think, how do we apply the things she's teaching us so that we can even do better? In Kentucky, we want to do more than we've ever done in 2022, but it's going to take a lot of effort to move people and move hearts, change minds, inspire people to open their wallets and all that kind of stuff. So we're looking for guidance from Dr. T to make that happen. Dr. T, welcome to our Zoom call. We're so glad you're here.
Well, wonderful. Thank you so much for the invitation to come speak and to talk to you all about housing and how we do a better job of maybe getting folks really excited about the exercise of what it means to make sure that people have a decent place to live, and how important that is, not just to our health as individuals, but to our community's health and to the well-being of our cities and states. And I have to say, I have for many years, this is probably about my 5th year working with Habitat in a variety of ways and different Habitat affiliates across the country. And I just love every time I get a chance to work with Habitat. I think that you all are probably doing, so much in the housing space. But even outside of that, I think, Habitat is from my mind, one of the few organizations in the country that's able to bring together people from all walks of life in just a, incredible way to have people really do something constructive in the service of not just their own personal lives, but in the service of others. And I hope you all agree, certainly probably you do, because you all are Habitat affiliates, right? That is such a unique and important, I think, skill set in this moment, right? To be having that happen. at a moment where the country is divided on a whole number of issues, and lots of things are in crisis, and lots of the pandemic and so much stuff happening. The ability to rely on organizations like Habitat that bring folks together to work constructively across racial lines, across religious lines, across political lines. I mean, you all really bring together, for folks who are in corporate America with folks who are in nonprofits, right, to really do some powerful work together. And that is a real strong, I would say, value proposition for what you do. And so I know that when many of you in the communities talk about Habitat, you talk about the importance of housing. I want to just say at the outset that I hope that you will also talk a lot about your ability to bring folks together across those differences. That is a huge value proposition for what you all bring to every community in which you work. And it's such a unique, I think about how many, the kinds of the few, I would say, remaining organizations that have that kind of power, right, in our society right now. So I would encourage you, just at the outset, as we're talking about how you get people excited about your work and the work in your communities, to sort of begin to start there. So listen, folks, this is an opportunity to think about housing, but also how you talk about it. I love it. Somebody in chat said the theology of the hammer. Absolutely. Right. Right. It is about like how you get people who may have never worked together before to find their common unity and purpose in something that is about community building. And so, yeah, thanks, Mary, for putting that in the chat. So I'm going to lead a conversation today. And as Lyle said at the outset, we want to make this really interactive. And I have to say, y'all, I'm a talker, so I can talk. But I also love the interaction. So I'm going to stop it periodically and just force y'all into the chat or force y'all into the conversation, because I think this often works best when we're able to just talk about the things that we're facing and the opportunities that we're seeing in our own communities. So I'm going to share my screen. But also what I want to do is I share my screen, I'm going to ask you first, before we even get started, so I know who's in the room. And I also know a little bit about, right, that is, I want you to put in the chat your name and the how many years you've been working with Habitat. So I'm going to put in the chat too, because I've been working with Habitat for about 5 years, of Habitat affiliates across the country. So I'm going to put in the chat my years in Habitat. Oh, yeah. Wow. Wow. All right. We got some veterans here. I'm seeing 22, 23. Whoa, Stephanie, 20. Wow. I like that. Wow, this is great. So we got a couple newbies in there. I think Madison and I are probably at the low end. We're at the 5-year marks, right on, Madison. You and I are probably at the low end of that spectrum, but we got a lot of folks who've been with Habitat 10 plus years. Love that, right? Love that. So most of the folks, that tells me most of the folks on this call, you all aren't new to Habitat. Orion, and Brian's got us beat. He's 3. All right. Oh, we got Kurt. All right, Kurt. Kurt's our winner, right, on the on one end of the spectrum. And let's see, who's our winner on the top end of the spectrum? Who we got that's longest? I thought it was at 25. Rob's got 25. Yeah. Oh, Barbara's got 30. All right. Anybody beats Barbara at 30?
Well, I have 33.
All right, Lyle.
I'm really an old fart.
You got the unfair advantage at the other end of the spectrum. I thought, this is like in all the competitions or whatever they are. The host never gets a chance to win the.
Yeah.
That's right. But I think that's really helpful, because I think what we have on the call today is a wide variety of folks who've been working with Habitat across a number of years. So folks who are new to the conversation can bring a different perspective. Folks who just joined and kind of really looking at this with fresh eyes, bring a lot of perspective to this conversation. And there's some of you who've been with Habitat 30 or more, or at least upwards of that, who have a lot of deep expertise over the long term with habitat. So we've got a lot of deep expertise over the conversation. So I'm going to talk at the very beginning of this about a little bit about the challenges that we face and about some of the need to get up and over those. And then I'm going to talk in the second part of the conversation just about some real just hardcore skill sets. Like, what are some things that we can do in the way that we talk about these issues around housing and why it's important to build stronger public will. And I'm going to talk about what that means in just a second, but to get stronger support for the work that we're trying to do, not just to build housing, but to build communities, to build resilience, right, in our communities, to build people's faith, right, in the American dream. I mean, that's really what we're talking about when you think about housing, to build people's ability to keep their families healthy, right? All of that is wrapped up in what we're talking about. So I want to make sure that we have plenty of time for that. So I'm going to walk through these slides. And like I said before, I'm going to stop periodically because I like to talk to y'all out there. I want to hear what you're thinking. I want to hear what you're thinking about. So, all right. So there's lots of you on the call who are familiar with my work. Some of you may not be. The work that I've been proselytizing across the country for a couple of years now, really talking to policymakers, community builders, to realtors, to affordable housing folks, to all kinds of people that I think, not just in the housing space, but also in the health space and climate change space, about the need to really engage the broader public and policymakers about getting people's faith build back up about our ability to do strong and important work in our communities, to build the public will to like do this really important work. We all know that the housing challenges that are facing our country are really severe. Right now in our country, we've got about 30 million people who are facing eviction and without federal action would be eligible to be evicted from their homes. And most of that is COVID just driven. Folks lost income, they lost jobs, and are in a position where they're not able to pay for the places where they rent or even their mortgages. And so we really have some really deep-seated issues that we just have to begin to solve for. So this is about how we do that, like how we get people not to be demoralized by that challenge, but to say, yes, we can do this, right? We are the most powerful nation in the world. We are by far one of the most prosperous nations in the world. We are one of the nations in the world that has the most ingenuity and creativity and innovation. There's got to be a way to harness that in the service of, right, addressing some of these issues like housing that are really important. So I feel committed. I feel really important to, it's really important to start the conversation talking about the moment we're in. I don't know if y'all know this, but April is Fair Housing Month. Fair housing is, for many of you, you haven't, probably for some of you, fair housing hasn't been a concern for you, but I know for the nation, this is a month where for housers to really think about what it means to address issues of fairness in housing, so nobody is discriminated against on the basis of a whole series of protected classes on race or ethnicity or sexual orientation, or maybe some of them may be differently abled, right? Maybe need wheelchair accessibility. Some families have different kinds of income, all kinds of issues that are really about fair housing driven. And I just want to remind us that it took us a long time to get here, folks. Fair housing laws passed in 1968, right, when the country was in a very different place. And it was tough. Fair housing was the last of, I would say, the civil rights protections to be passed. And it took us a while to get there. But we ended up with a particular piece of legislation that at very least protected people's the access to the ideal of housing without discrimination, but there's still a lot of work to do on that. And what I would say to you is, fair housing as an issue, reinforces this idea that your home is an entryway to so many other things. Where you live determines where you get to go to school, how you get to your jobs, whether you have healthy food environments. And really for everybody, the National Fair Housing Alliance really sort of works with a number of issues. And this one in particular talks about issues of racial disparities. We know there are disparities in communities about what people have access to. And so the conversation is, how do we make sure that everybody has access to a community that is thriving? And so I just want to, in celebration of that, this fair housing theme of HUD's housing theme for 2021 is that let's make fair housing more than just, bless you, Lyle.
Excuse me.
Bless you. That is more than just words, right? We have to put that into action. And so as a part of April's theme, I want to make sure that everybody is reminded of just the commitment that we made nationally to make sure that everybody has equal access to housing in some way, shape, or form. Okay, so let's talk about, right, the challenges that we're in. Again, the first part is going to be a little bit about the challenges that we're facing as we're trying to do this work. And then the second part really about the skill set that we bring and the optimism I hope it will bring to making things a lot better. So as I talked about before, we're in a tough pickle, folks. Housing is tough. And even before COVID-19, many people across the country were already experiencing a lot of housing issues. Right, we're just not building enough. Y'all know this, right? We haven't been building enough housing to support the number of people that as the population growth is changing. And as people are moving across the country to different places, we haven't been keeping up with that mobility. And that was already before COVID-19. And now with COVID-19, even more so. So no matter what city you live in, whether you're in Memphis or Indianapolis, or whether you're in Ohio, no matter where you are, the policymakers that are in your communities are facing some pretty tough situations. They're having to figure out, or just even to think about, like, how they address some of these issues that are tougher than we've seen in a generation. So a part of that is, I want to say to you all, how we respond in this moment matters. I mean, you all are in the space. You all know what it takes to build housing. You know the not just the technical requirements of that work, but you know what it takes to align stakeholders behind that. You got to get employers, you got to get funders, you got to get the housing departments and the planning departments behind you, right? All the things that it takes, right, to do this work. Not many people across this country know as much as you all do in Habitat about how to do that. So guess what? Y'all are in deep demand, and especially you all have a specific, responsibility and opportunity to build housing in a way that is deeply personal for folks. Y'all are not just builders building it and then you walk away. When I get on Habitat calls across the country, one of the things that always strikes me is there's always a conversation with the family that gets the home, right? There's a interaction there. You get to have people not only build a little bit of sweat equity in that, but you get to see what happens when people are given the opportunity and access to a home. So in this moment when the country is trying to figure out what to do about housing, and your policymakers, no matter where you live, are pretty much stuck, Habitat represents a real opportunity to engage those policymakers more dramatically and more specifically. I'd love to hear in the chat, if anybody's, give me a sort of +1, if any of you in the chat, if had these conversations with some of your local policymakers just about what they're doing in response to some of the housing challenges. And it doesn't, and you don't necessarily have to, I know that's not always sort of Habitat's focus, but listen, tell me about if there's anything that you all have done in your own communities to try and respond, or try to, link up with some of these policymakers that are really, bless their little hearts, stuck with a whole lot of challenges they didn't create. None of us created, but with COVID-19, a whole series of issues. I mean, they're really facing just this challenge. I mean, what do you do when you got lots of folks who can't pay their mortgage? Tough situation. I mean, that is really, and people are looking to organizations to do something about that. Any of you in the chat having those conversations with local policymakers about some of these issues? I'd love to hear that if you are. Mary says, yep, need to do more. We need to make sure policymakers know Habitat has their back. Rent, but home ownership too. Yeah, that's actually, yeah.
Can I share just a story real fast about Habitat? Because you've kind of inspired me to think about this. This is an experience outside our country in Belfast. Belfast for years had such a problem with the integration of Protestants and Catholics. They didn't have a housing problem, but we were invited to go there, not because they needed housing, because the only place we could get land was a place they called no man's land. And that's where they dumped the bodies between the Catholic and Protestant neighborhoods. So we started out building in those neighborhoods. But what we were able to do was get Catholics and Protestants to work on houses together. Wow. And ultimately, they started giving us space in their own neighborhoods. So the Catholics would actually march through the Protestant neighborhood to build on a Saturday morning. and then march back. And the Protestants would do the same on the Catholic side. So, we have groups in the United States that are not getting along now, but we could use Habitat the same way they did in Belfast to help integrate, build relationships, and help, inclusion. It's all about getting diverse groups to work together, and we can do that. So I'm just thinking about the challenge you laid out there, Dr. T, and there's an example of how we might do it in our communities. Maybe we should ask the Urban League and the police department to build a house together.
You got it.
That's
exactly right.
Think outside the box.
That's exactly right. Lyle, you get exactly where I'm going here.
Okay, good. Sorry to interrupt.
Yeah, no. Yeah. And some folks are talking in the chat just the conversation about, what they've seen policymakers locally do. Chodos, right, utilize home as a potential. Yep, I know that. Talking about home program at part of the administration's proposal. Yeah. And so I think, here's the good news, and we're going to talk about this in a second. Necessity is the mother of invention, right? Because policymakers are in a tough pickle, right? They're going to have to be more creative than ever before, right? They're going to need ideas and inspiration from a variety of places like never before. I mean, really, it just, like nobody owns the space right now because everybody's looking at each other like, what do we do? And so so necessity is the mother of invention, that we have to work together to figure this thing out. I think, Martin Luther King once said, we either work together as brothers or we perish together as fools, right? And because none of us wants to perish together as fools, right? right? There's an imperative for us to work together to figure out how do we make sure that our families are safe and have a decent place to live. And I want to go just in this moment, just Lyle, exactly where you were talking about, which is just across differences, and just talk about that as a headwind that we're facing in the work that we do. One that which I think we've been able to avoid, but one is certainly a concern. Right? We know that nationally, let's just acknowledge what the headwinds are. Nationally, we've got sort of political kind of craziness. And I would say that one of the nice things, I wouldn't say the nice things, but one of the things about housing is housing has always been a bipartisan issue, despite the fact that the political parties are usually going at it and what you see on the screen here. There's a real need to stay bipartisan, and that gets tough in this environment where there's so much going on back and forth. But housing has always been this kind of issue that whether you're Democrat, Republican, or something in between, or not even affiliated, right? People have always seen housing as something that nobody owns because all of us owns it. And that has actually been a good thing for us. But it's also, let's just acknowledge too, I wrote a paper in 2016 with some colleagues of mine, just talking about some of the narratives that were challenging around particularly affordable housing. When you talk about affordable housing and what that means, that there's a whole lot of folks who just think negatively about that. When you say the words affordable housing, that can backfire, right? People say, I don't want that affordable stuff in my house, in my neighborhood, despite the fact that you might be building the most beautiful home on the block, right? Which is often what happens for Habitat. Like the homes that y'all build are probably better than any of the housing stock around, right? The housing, right? There are folks who just make assumptions about what it means for folks who are maybe who don't have, are low income or middle income. They make those kind of assumptions. And so we talked about in this paper that there are some of our messages that are backfiring, and we just have to be very thoughtful about that. So when you say, listen, we need more affordable housing in our community, people are paying too much to be able to rent apartments, or, don't have the money for a down payment for a home. There are lots of folks who unfortunately will say, well, listen, buy the house you can afford, stop making excuses. I worked hard for my house, you got to work hard too. We shouldn't be giving handouts to people that makes them dependent on government or dependent on other people. And so I don't want that to stop us. And part of the reason we wrote the paper was to say, we don't have to engage in that conversation. There are ways to get up and over that conversation and get people to support housing. And so what I just want to lift that up here is, for those of you who may be hearing some of that, right, in their work, that there are ways to have a different kind of conversation and redirect that effort. And the last thing I want to say as a headwind is just that we're in a moment where, right, we all know COVID-19 is rough, right? That for a lot of folks in a lot of jurisdictions across the country, it's been tough to get policymakers to focus on housing as an issue when we're so focused on just health issues. That shouldn't detract us either. It's just a headwind, right? People don't necessarily see the sort of systems challenges until they're standing in line trying to figure out like how to get food or how to get access to resources they need in their communities. That should not deter us. It just means we have to be present and aware of what that needs. So what I'm going to say to you is I'm going to assume that all of y'all are adaptive leaders. We don't need crisis communications. We don't need people to, what we need is leadership. And one of the things I appreciate about Habitat as an organization is that Habitat, I think, sort of, nurtures and cultivates leaders in every community across this country. Y'all see that? Right. I was on a Habitat call with some of the folks in Connecticut, and some of the folks on the call were just talking about how being as a part of the Habitat family has just shifted their whole perspective and allowed them to be much more vocal, not just as advocates for housing, but allow them to kind of show up in other parts of their lives in a much more thoughtful way. And so I just want to stop and just say, for those of you, put in the chat, like if you have, had that experience of having the, Habitat as a part of your, opportunity and experience, has it forced you to show up differently in terms of your leadership in other spaces of your life? Like you go to your job or your family or your church, or you're like, and a whole set of skills that you didn't even know you had, right? Sort of showed up in part because of the work that you've had to do and Habitat. So I'd love to see that in chat if folks have experienced that. And I want to also just acknowledge Madison. Thank you for that. You were talking about the term affordable housing and the need to reframe that terminology. And I love that. Madison says, let's reclaim it. Let's go out and get it. I love that. So the question on the floor is about leadership, right? And Habitat experience allowed you to kind of access a different kind of leadership than you were experiencing before. Anybody have that experience? Whoa, nobody on this call? Nobody on this call? I don't believe that. I absolutely do not believe that. Well, if that's the case, if nobody's experienced the idea that your work in Habitat has kind of led to a different kind of leadership, then what I would probably do is just first to sort of step back and say, leadership is not about you being that president or the vice president of some major corporation or some major community-based organization. Leadership in the way that I'm talking about is really being a guide in your community, like showing folks a way to do things a bit better, having a strong voice that leads to community building in a way that is positive and constructive in your community, in your family, in your church, whatever that is. And if you are doing that, even without the title, you are being a leader, right? So and I would say right now, we need guides and way showers. Folks are confused about what's happening. They're uncertain about their future, right? And so anything that we can do to be way showers, to be guides, right? To be, hey, there's a different way to do this, folks. There's a different way to build housing. There's a different way to support our community members. There's a way to support people as we move forward. Come on, folks, there's a way to do this, right? And I thank you, Regina, for saying that in the chat, that there's a way to be a guide, right? Maybe not, even for those folks who may not naturally connect to leadership. So I'm going to say, for our conversation today, I'm going to talk a lot about leadership. For those of you who feel like maybe guide is a better way to think about their role, have at it. No problem with that. But I'm going to talk about leadership in that way, that the guidance that thank you, Ryan, servant leadership, love it. Yep. And Rihanna, right, looking to be community-centric leaders, absolutely. Lifting up other voice and empowering communities, absolutely, that is exactly right. And I'm going to be talking about adaptive leadership, right? Our communities are changing. There's so much disruption happening in our communities right now. Everything is moving and in transition. Even technology, right? Every time I look up, there's a new thing that like I have, my kids are bringing in the house. I'm like, what is that, right? Many of you may have that same experience. That with all that kind of disruption, there is a need for us to be adaptive, right? When all those disruptions happen, whatever they may be, whether it's COVID-19 or some new technology or whatever it is, a need to help the people in our community adapt to what is happening, right? So I'm going to talk about that, the real need for that kind of leadership. And I'll talk about that specifically with relationship to housing and maybe a little bit in terms of health. So let me just say, the single biggest failure of leadership is really when we start to treat adaptive problems like they're technical. And I want to say, some people think that housing is a technical problem. To some extent it is. You got to know about the specs, right? You got to know like the building codes. You got to know that makes it a technical problem, but it's also an adaptive problem. And we need to talk about that part of it. So, so let me just define technical versus adaptive. Like technical is like what's happening now with related to COVID-19, that, lots of us may have not felt like we could go into hospitals and we need to have televisits and all that kind of stuff. The technical challenges, we solved that, right? There are ways to connect to our doctors and other things online, right? You can have a telehealth appointment or all kinds of things. The adaptive is to understand what, like, the internet is though not your doctor, right? What's happened in the pandemic, we know, is that lots of folks have gone to the internet to sort of self-diagnose, and then they're like, oh my God, I have this chronic disease, and like, because the internet will give you all this kind of crazy information and these, diagnoses, and that's not usually what happens. So part of the technical challenges, can we give people care, right, through the technology that we have? Absolutely, we can do that. The adaptive challenges, can we also make sure that people understand how to use that technology to serve their health and not get to the other part of it, which is to think that the internet is their doctor, or to, right, not be able to engage thoughtfully. So how does that technical and adaptive play out in our housing system, right? How does that work out, right? So I love it, Lyle. He said technology helps set the expectations. Absolutely, right? It's time we change the name to Leadership and Vision after COVID. I love that. So for many of us who are navigating this sort of technology world, we're going to talk about that, about how that impacts the housing space. Affordable housing from the vantage point of the public, if we talk about it only in technical terms, people think about it in technical terms. And I put this up because I always say, some of you may have heard me say this before, often people think, well, housing, you can just buy one of those on Amazon.com. I mean, I think that is like that is the default these days. If you can't get on Amazon.com, what value is it, right? And they think that if housing is just a technical problem, then you can get one off Amazon.com. And I like to say that not only can you get it off Amazon.com, but if you have Amazon Prime, they'll deliver it for free. They have free shipping, right? And free returns, right? And they even have different models. You can get the ones that have solar panels attached to it, right? Right? Get them delivered. There's a home, there's a house. And so, that's a part of the challenge for us. There are ways to 3D print a house for less than $4,000 in 24 hours, right? And there's a version of these different technological models, right? But I want to say that for those of you on this call and Habitat, that housing, that housing is more than just, right, 4 walls and a roof. There's so many issues embedded. Where do you site it? Like, how do you make sure that it withstands the permitting process in your own communities? How do you get people to participate in the building of that home so that there is community building embedded in it, right? There's so many other elements to what is here. It's not just a call up Amazon and do it. It's not just a 3D print it. That there's so much more involved in that as an adaptive set of problems that we have to get people to understand, especially at this moment. So I'd love for folks to, in the chat, if you can, just talk about the places where you've seen some of those, the adaptive challenge of people sort of looking at housing as if, you can just do, yeah, here's my experience. What I would say about that, I'm gonna go back to this other slide. My experience is that most people do not understand how housing gets built in their communities. I mean, literally, they think that Habitat folks, y'all just go to Home Depot, get a couple 2x4s, a couple toilets, get a couple beers on a Saturday, right? Get to the job site, throw it up there, and then you're right. They don't know the level and intensity of work that you actually have to do to get housing built anywhere in America, but especially, right, for and with people who are not able to afford, right, all the trappings of what it means to create housing. And because they don't understand that, when you all come to folks and say, we need money to do this work that we do, we need resources, we need expertise, there are folks who will say, well, don't you just need, right, get on it on Amazon.com. And I wonder, for many of your affiliates, are you all feeling the sort of, I would say, the Amazonization, if that's a word, of that experience, that it's really just a matter of, well, you just go to Home Depot, you get the 2x4s, you get people on a good Saturday to come on out, put their little vest on, right? As opposed to the adaptive challenge, which is all the actual work that it takes. And think about the iceberg, right? People can see the top of that iceberg, but they never see the bulk of it, which is actually underwater, right? So they think, when they look at Habitat, y'all are out there on a Saturday, right, with Home Depot, you get, what they don't see is all the internal work that you all do to actually make that happen. Anybody in chat experiencing that? And the difficulty and the opportunity and the challenges of getting people to see that. So thanks, Madison. She puts in the chat, yep, that from your vantage point, you see people don't have an issue with understanding the cost, but the operational costs are a different story. What it takes to operate as an affiliate and do the work, right, has a cost as well, and that people have to they have to understand that there's that as well. Yeah. And Regina says, yes, we've grown way beyond the volunteer built homes. We got a whole operation going on here that's larger than even the way that people perceive what you do. And I like what Mary said too, that building a house is the easy part. It's the families taking ownership. It's the success of their success, the future, the moving, what changes the home bring to their life. Is that kind of work, right? That needs the most questions and the data we need to know, not so much about the actual building of the home. I appreciate that, Mary. Thanks for that. And Jamila says, is that hearing the misunderstanding, maintaining affordability in the long run. Oh boy. Yeah. And that's the adaptive part. Like, what does that take, right? And that you all are really, yeah, that's a huge issue. Yeah, thank you for that. Because there's so much involved in that process and thinking about this that we have to get folks to understand that. So I'm going to say, here's, I think, and Rihanna says the value of time, not just money, is often overlooked. Oh boy, I love that. Laura says our public magically believes that we get grants to build. Yes, it's so wonderful how y'all just magically, get these houses built. I mean, literally like that. So the good news is that people recognize Habitat for Humanity as a brand. I think that part of the challenges are the things that y'all are missing, that they narrow down what y'all do into these little small boxes, and you're like, but we're so much more than that, right? We're doing so much more than that becomes a conversation. And Regina says, and they're shocked when our home appraises for more than theirs. Well, that's what I was saying at the very top of this, the call today, is that, that often when I see Habitat, sort of the Habitat homes are usually the best ones on the block. And there's this interesting dynamic that sometimes, people in the community may, look a little sideways when they see a Habitat house going up, and that makes them nervous because they think it's, sometimes they think it's a quote unquote affordable housing. And then, as you say, when it goes up and it appraises for more than theirs, like, wait a minute, what just happened? These Habitat folks just built a home, on top of mine. So what I would say to you all is that you all have to be both help people think about not only just, right, the need to build homes and to make sure that people have access to them, but helping them understand this sort of adaptive challenges, all the things that y'all mentioned in the chat about the appraisal process, about the building permits, about those things. And you don't have to get into that at a level of granularity. Not everybody can go there with you, but unless we start to have people sort of imagine and dream and think about those kinds of issues too, then it limits their understanding of what you all do and the value that they see that you all bring as affiliates to Habitat, right? As Ryan says, everybody wants affordable homes, there to be affordable homes, but nobody wants to build them in their community, and that becomes a huge challenge. So I will say to you all that one of the things that you can do, and I will say this in terms of what I bring to this conversation, is putting people in the future is always better. One of the ways you can get people over some of that opposition is to position people in the future, right? And we'll talk about that. And so when you say that let's think about 2025 and 2030. What do we want our cities, our towns, our community to look like, and who do we want, right, to be, and do we want everybody to have access to a decent place to live in our community, right? What does it look like to have a healthy, functioning community? That future-oriented vision gets people excited because the future is something we can build together, right? And so one of the skill set that I want to encourage you all to take on is this notion of putting people in the future, right? And what that requires. Even if you get people to just dream a little bit outside of their orientation to their communities about what that future orientation could look like. So to get y'all in the spirit of that, I want to actually share, that I want to share a little bit about adaptive leaders and putting us in the future. And I want you to think about what that exercise might have been like for Bill Gates when he was first talking about the computer and this crazy thing called the internet, and what it took, right, to get people to think about that as an issue and what it did to people's imagination. So I want you to play a little clip of when he was talking to David Letterman about this many years ago.
But I think about this, and what about this internet thing? Do you know anything about that?
Sure.
What the hell is that exactly?
Well, it's become a place where people are publishing information.
Right.
So everybody can have their own homepage. Companies are there. The latest information. It's wild what's going on. You can send electronic mail to people. It is the big new thing.
Yeah, but it's easy to criticize something you don't fully understand, which is my position here.
Go ahead.
But I can remember a couple of months ago, there was like a big breakthrough announcement that on the internet or on some computer deal, they were going to broadcast a baseball game. You could listen to a baseball game on your computer. And I just thought to myself, does radio ring a bell? You know what I mean?
There's a difference.
Remember that, you all are, for to some extent, right, putting people in the future, right, is sometimes interesting, but what it makes people dream about, like, what's possible. And so I want you to be thinking, let's take a page out of the book of some of the technologists, Steve Jobs and, all these folks who do technology, not because we want to valorize technology, but because they're always having to position people in the future, that a part of the role of and the opportunity for Habitat is to get people out of the current sort of thinking that is challenging, but what is the future of this community and what do we want it to look like and how do we get there? Well, one way to do that is to make sure that people have a decent place to live and that we are building the infrastructure necessary in this community to make that happen. That's how we get to that fantastic future. And I love it. Remember, Steve Jobs said sometimes our task is not to wait until people are in crisis to say, hey folks, but to read what's not even on the page yet, right? That's a part of our opportunity and responsibility, right? To get people, right, to totally sort of lean into this as an opportunity. So I wonder if, and there's so much kind of technology sort of coming on board for home building and so much more technology, even coming on board just in our communities, right? Technology is one thing, but the idea here, I think, is more to have people imagine themselves even outside of what I would say as the current opportunities. And I'm gonna fast through a couple slides here. What housing could look like. Even things like this, right? This may or may not be kind of in the sweet spot of Habitat, but I think it's ideas for helping communities adapt. On the left side is a church group that just determined that they were going to become a part of the solution to help more of their parishioners be able to afford housing. And so they've taken on this whole financial model they call Emmanuel House to try to do that. I think of Habitat in some respect as a different kind of financial model, but in the same way of trying to be innovative and thoughtful in that way. Some folks are trying to do the tiny homes, kind of whatever that is, because I think that's a way to get there. Whatever that is, I think Habitat, particularly if we think about Habitat surviving in the next millennia or whatever that is, it's really being on the forefront of innovation. What is it that allows y'all to be innovative, right? To continue to innovate around these issues? Is it a different kind of financial model that you collaborate with folks on their communities? Is it a different type of house building? Is it mixed income housing? Is it, right, helping the community engage in a process that is, outside of the box? The current some folks are in some places it's only single family home. Maybe other kinds of varieties of homes. I mean, but whatever that is, getting people to think about the future in that community and what it needs and how we get there is a huge opportunity, particularly given, you know, Lila, as you were saying before, that you get a chance to engage people at all levels, you know, employers and community-based organizations and houses of worship. Wow, that's the exciting part. And here's the thing, when you get people to think like that, to start thinking innovatively in the future, what happens is a lot of their preconceptions about quote unquote affordable housing and all this other negative stuff kind of falls away because they get excited about the dream of what it could be and what we could do, and we can create that together, what it could look like. And that's the spirit and the energy that you want to get people into. Any thoughts about that? You can put them in the chat. Any thoughts about that? Just, you know, in a variety of ways, like how you get people to just think outside of the current box and innovate, to be thoughtful about what the future holds, whether, no matter what city or state you're in. Man, this is and this is what I was saying before, that necessity is the mother of invention. You can create whatever you want. You can change the financial model. You can change the housing type, right? You can create different ways of working together. I mean, this is the moment to be in that creative energy. And it's that gets people really excited to align with y'all. Like, that's the thing that helps people to align with what y'all trying to do. Anybody experiencing that? Yeah, thank you, Mary. We need to be brave enough to do this, right? To be really adaptive. Lyle says, yeah, rent to own, apartment for condo. Absolutely. All kinds of, even, you know, as we talk about health, you know, aging in place options. We got a lot of seniors. They're just not going to be able to maintain a single family home, right? And we know there are lots of folks who are building a different kind of situation for those folks. But I would say, you know, there are lots of varieties of what that could look like. Some people just want a townhouse or a condo, or, you know, different kind of thing, or they want to be able to do, you know, have other kinds of options, right? So how, you know, is Habitat, you know, in every community kind of, you know, collaborating with folks who are thinking in that space, right? For the seniors in our community who need to be age, who want to either age in place or who need different kinds of housing solutions, what could that look like? Oh my gosh. And you all are the right folks to do that because of where you are positioned in the housing space. There's nobody else, right, that you are, right, who gets folks together in the same kind of way to be able to do that. That's exactly right. So that's where I'm going next, right? Warren Buffett had this to say, and I believe this is true. Predicting rain doesn't count, building arcs does. Doesn't matter if you can predict, right, that the rains are coming, right? We all can predict that housing is going to get tougher. We all can predict that, you know, a lot of seniors are aging and going to need some different kind of options. We all can predict that lots of millennials, right, saddled with student loan debt are not going to be able to afford to buy a home anytime soon because they're struggling to get out from under college, you know. So we can predict the tsunami that's coming. The opportunity is the arc that we're building. And one of the things I will say to you all is, you all, you know, understand that the stakeholders who are involved in the communities, not even go to this one, that you're trying to build consensus around different ways of moving forward. So I'll go back to Dr. King on this. I was saying that just because I'm reminded specifically that the Fair Housing Law passed after the assassination of Dr. King. It really, really in part a response to that. But I also want to say that what I loved about Dr. King and his approach was the idea that he understood that consensus was not something that you try to find. You have to build it. Like, you got to build it. You got to bring folks together. You got to like talk to folks about what is it, how is it that we can work together? It's a practice. It's a process, right? It's not like you're looking out there like, where's the consensus? Where do we find it? Where is their agreement, right? You got to go build it with people of different, and for him, it was about people of different faiths. But for us, it's with people across different, you know, across all kinds of difference, right? That y'all are able to bring together in the service of thinking more creatively and collaboratively. So I think if we think about that, there's a real opportunity to support this work. I'm gonna fast forward through a couple of these slides. I want to get us through. I was going to talk about data, but I won't talk about data so much. I want to talk about the other case that we're building for this work. So I want to think about how we advance a stronger conversation about housing, and I'm going to start in the craziest of places. We're going to take a page out of the book of some of our corporate retailers. Nike's one of them. We could pick probably any of them, or any of the big ones. One of the things that Nike knows, like many of our corporate retailers, is that they can get you to buy sneakers faster by speaking to the aspirations of the folks they're talking to. So in this case, they know that no matter who we are as Americans, we just want to be like, we want to feel fearless and we want to like just do it, right? And so they feed us these images of people doing just amazing things, right? Speaking to our aspirations, and they figured out that they can get us to buy more sneakers that way than showing us even sneakers in their commercials. I mean, think about the last time you saw a Nike shoe in a Nike commercial. The answer is never. They don't do it. Because it's not the shoe that you're really buying, right? You're not really buying the shoe, because really, right, if you really want to exercise, any shoe will do. And probably there are a lot of shoes that can do it for a lot cheaper than the Nike version you want to buy. But they figured out what they're selling you is the ideal of who you want to be, that aspiration, right? And so corporate retailers do this better than anybody else. They don't start by giving you, I mean, think about this for those of you who have Nike shoes, right? Do you know anything about the quality of the leather? Do you know anything about the quality of the shoestrings or the how they're made or the, right? You don't know anything about that, right? And yet billions of people across our planet will buy these things we know almost nothing about. Why is that? Because they also hire a lot of cognitive scientists, many like myself, who can tell them that it's not, people lean forward not because of the what you're offering, they lean forward because the aspiration you're giving them. So I want to go back to something Mary said in the chat. It was early on, and she was saying something about what's really, the thing that's really important, so I've got to go back further, is that what this means, the home to folks is access to the future, people moving forward. What changes does it bring in people's lives? That's the aspiration that people have. I got to tell you, in housing, I do this work all across the country in just about every community. And oftentimes we call community voice sessions. And what we're listening for in those community voice sessions is what's the aspiration of the people we're talking to. What would help them to lean into a conversation based on who they are, not what we are. So I can tell you, I just finished some work in Connecticut, and I can tell you, we talked to a lot of folks in Connecticut about what's going on in their lives and what are the aspirations they have for their own lives. And I remember one of these guys was a small business man, about middle age, and he was talking about housing, and he said, this housing stuff, it's not really for me. I don't really know much about affordability. He said, I just know that I grew up in Connecticut, and most of my friends that I grew up with have moved away because it was just too expensive, right? They moved to other places. And many of them would love to move back just because they love to be back in their own hometown, but it's just too expensive. And he said, you know what, at the end of the day, I just want my friends back, right? In other words, his interest in housing was not about, right, this whole deal about who can, right, necessarily who can afford it and how many folks. It was like this really basic thing about, I just really want my friends back. I want to be in a community where the people that I love and who love me and who I love to go out with on a Saturday and play basketball with or play tennis with or whatever can afford to be here. And let me just tell you, if that's the thing that people are concerned about in your community, then that's the way to get them interested in what Habitat does. So I want you in the chat to tell me, like when you talk to people in the community, what gets them interested in this stuff? I'll give you another example. We were just doing some work in San Francisco talking about homelessness, which most of you probably know is pretty severe. And we did a lot of these community listening sessions, and we asked people the question about what do you lose if San Francisco is not able to deal with and get its hands around what is a severe crisis. I mean, they've got tent cities in almost every major park and every public space. People are talking about it's almost impossible to sit in an outdoor restaurant in San Francisco right now because you're trying to be outdoors and enjoy an experience, and that's impossible because of so many folks costing you on even just an outdoor restaurant. You just can't do it. And one of the guys said, I remember a time when I was younger and, I could grab my kids on a Sunday afternoon, grab a blanket and a picnic basket, throw some sandwiches, me and my wife, we could go to the park, lay out in the park and just, let the kids run around. We could even go to sleep on our little blankets as parents and let the kids run around for hours and come back to the picnic basket and eat whenever they wanted to. And but you spend the whole day in the park just having that experience. And he said, what really makes me sad about this situation is in San Francisco, we have a whole generation of young people who are growing up in an environment where they will never have that experience. There is not a public park in San Francisco right now where you could take a blanket, right, and a picnic basket and just have a Sunday afternoon, right, without being in the middle of a homeless encampment. It's just not possible, or being accosted in some way. And I don't want that to be negatively perceived as like, we got to deal with homelessness because it impacts our own circumstances, but it means that if that's the experience that people are having, then meet them where they are. That's their aspiration. On a Sunday afternoon, I just want to be able to be in a park and experience a public space with my kids or with my grandkids. If that's the thing that gets them interested in housing, give it to them. Do the thing that Nike knows. What Nike knows is give them the thing that they're asking for, right? Which is the bigger aspiration for their own lives. So I'd love to see in the chat, when you think about people in your community, right? Have you listened to those aspirations? What's the aspirations that might drive them to be interested in the housing that y'all are created? And I'm not talking about the making sure that everybody has a home. I'm talking about deep interpersonal, wow, that kind of stuff. For me, the thing that I just want this, right? Ariana says people just want more community. I want to feel like I belong to a place that is making space for folks. I want to feel that again, right? In some places, Rihanna is belonging. There's so many of our communities that are transient right now. People are moving in and out because they can't afford to be stable for long periods of time. And so you don't know your neighbors. I mean, think about that. I want to be in a place where people feel like they can put down roots and stay here and where we know each other. That's all. In some of the communities where we work, I just want to feel like I'm a neighbor who knows my neighbors, right? If that's the thing that people aspire to, give it to them. Connect to that inclination as a way of building more support for your work. I want to see some more of that. When you think about the aspirations, and maybe even for you, think about your own lives. What is it that you aspire to, right? That you want to see? Like, man, here's what I want. And then think about how we connect that back to housing. So I want to see some more. Things in the chat, and I'm going to talk through a few more that I see. We did some work in Minnesota around housing, and folks said, I just want to feel like my kids have a shot at success. I'm in Minnesota, and I'm looking at the economic climate and the market and how much homes cost, and I don't think my kids will ever be able to afford to live here. And that is my major concern. If that's people's concern, then we are working toward a future that gives your kids and every other kid that's grown up in Minnesota a chance to live here and be here. Is that it? Right? Catherine said, specifically in the chat, folks are looking for a place with resources they need. I just want to live in a place that has childcare and healthcare where I can get to easily, right? I don't want to live in a place where I have to drive a long time to get to food or resources. Mary says walkability. I want my kids to be able to play outside and not have to be concerned about those kids. If that's what people want, right, give it to them. We were doing some of this work in DC, and people told us they were concerned about the quality of the schools. So we worked on some language with them to help connect that together. When things like this, people talked about, listen, folks, if you want the schools to get better, you need to lean into housing, because the number one challenge the school districts are likely facing, recruiting teachers is tough, especially when they can't afford to live here, right? And so in this particular one, we said, the school system said our biggest hurdle in having quality education is HOUSING, housing. It's helping our teachers find and secure affordable places where they can live in our region. So they said, listen, let's be honest, we are facing some of the biggest teacher shortages we've ever had because housing isn't available. So if you really want to improve the schools, you want better opportunities for your kids, then you need to lean into housing. And so even at the end of this, you'll see on the right side of the screen at the bottom, we said, so when someone asks you how they can improve the schools, spell it out for them. HOUSING, housing, right? Right, making sure that our teachers have what they need, not only to live here, but to be strong advisors, right, to our kids. If that's what people are needing, and they tell you that they want, that's the way to get them interested in what Habitat is working on. Give them what they want, right? Some folks said in the chat, safety. I want fairness and rights. Home renters don't have any of it at this time. That's right. Scarcity of housing is an issue. That's exactly right. That's exactly right. For home renter to fight for their rights instead of just leaving as soon as it comes. Absolutely. The stability of people in neighborhoods, security for children and teenagers, right? That's huge. If somebody tells you, for example, they're concerned about the future of their kids, it may not even be connected to schools, talk to them about the importance of stable housing and what that does for us to be able to be strong stewards for our children. So I hope that y'all get that. Like, that is the thing that, like, it's one thing, and let me ask, how many of y'all really get that? That it's one thing to talk at a high level about housing as a thing we need to be. It's a whole nother thing to be talking to people's aspirations, right? And have them really get all in their feelings, all in their hearts about why this is so important. And that's what I'm asking y'all to do. And this is not an intellectual exercise, not a technical problem. This is an adaptive one. How do we help people adapt to a world in which it's clear that these things are necessary to solve a whole lot of issues that are on the table? Y'all get that? This is about how we get people to lean forward because their hearts are aligned to what we're trying to do, not because they've done an intellectual exercise to like, yes, we don't have enough housing to support, right, our labor markets. I mean, think about that. Who comes home at the end of a long day of work and knows that, listen, we have to lean it. We got to figure out what's going on with the housing in our community because the labor market can't support the kind of talent we need without building more, without housing. We got to figure that out. After a long day of work, said nobody ever, right? Nobody comes home from a long day of work and says, yes, the labor market is, or we've not been building enough. We've got it, right? What people will tell you is, I just want my friends back. Well, if you talk to folks long enough, they'll tell you, I just want to feel like I got neighbors, right, who feel safe in this community and who don't have to scramble as much to try to make ends meet and who don't have to move because things have gotten too expensive. That's the kind of conversation that I hope y'all are embracing, because that's at the end of the day, the kind of thing that helps people to lean forward. That's right. And Virginia says, yes, that their aspirations hopefully are built into the power of helping people at all levels of income, of race and education, right, to get access. That's absolutely right. And this kind of conversations, even when you first have the conversation with them, if they don't automatically see their stake in it, your ability to connect to connect the needs of everybody to those aspirations is what makes all the difference. And so that's what I'm asking y'all to do in this conversation. Rihanna says, I call this the why dive. We have to go back to the deeper why. Absolutely. Yes. That's the deeper why. Exactly. Not the sort of surface why, not the technical why. What's the deeper why that helps people to be able to lean into these conversations? In some places, like in San Francisco, folks talk a lot about just the sort of racial strife and the fighting, this infighting across different groups. And so when we talk to people in San Francisco, what they told us was, listen, folks, once and for all, we just want to solve this, right? We just want to, we're tired of fighting, right? We just want a community in which people are working together to do the things we need to do for an equitable future, period. And if that means housing, let's do it. If that's the issue, you're in a particular part of the country that is, it's been tough and people are tired of fighting, give it to them. Yes, right? Especially for a habitat model. This is the way, right? We bring people together once and for all to solve this as an issue. If that's what they're interested in, give it to them, right? Pull people forward, right? By connecting to their larger aspirations. All right, I won't beat that dead horse. I won't sort of continue to go there. Let's talk about some of these other issues. One of the other principles that I'll talk about is just how you get people to navigate some of those negative issues that they may have about affordable housing or about homelessness or about any other thing. In some of the places where I work, we have asked people to talk to, when there are cases where they're negative, when there are negative or what we call dominant narratives in place, that you've got to reframe that conversation or it's hard for people to get to embrace this. So we were talking earlier in the conversation about affordable housing and sometimes how that can be have negative connotations. One way to get around that is to have people think about the power of an address, right? Ask people to think about like, especially if you're dealing with issues of homelessness, right? But even affordable housing, what is the power of having an address? Most people don't take the time to think about that, like what you gain from having an address, or better yet, what happens if you don't have one, and one that is stable. I mean, your access to be able to vote is connected to your address. Your ability to enroll your kids in school is connected to an address. Your ability to get benefits if you're a senior citizen or if you're a disability, all that is connected to your address. I mean, just go down the list, and there are about 25 things, but core things that are central to you being a fully acknowledged human being in our country that cannot happen without an address. You can't get a job without an address, right? The employer has to have some address of record, right? Right? Think about what that means. Like, an address is more than just four walls and a roof. Having an address is powerful. So we talk about the power of an address. Think about right now, COVID-19, if you don't have an address, right? Man, the ability for education, for those of us who are like, you got kids at home and trying to be like part-time educators in our homes, your home is now the school. Even for those of us who are doing things like continuing education, how many people are now going to school in college, Strayer University or some of these other ones, at home? What happens if you don't have one, or one that's stable? Those activities are not open to you. Or jobs, like right now, most of us are in our home offices or in our home places, right? For lots of us, that has become, our homes have become, right, the way that we get to a job. Without that address, for lots of us, having that employment is not possible anymore. Or healthcare. Think about how much healthcare now is delivered in your homes. And in fact, it used to be that when you went into the hospital to even get, like, basic care or sort of minor operations, they keep you in the hospital for a few days. If you haven't noticed, they don't do that anymore. They get you out of there real fast because it costs them a lot of money to have you laying in the bed for a long time in the hospital. So they do whatever they have to do and they move you on. Like, you get your knee replaced, that's an in and out surgery. That's like, you come in at 2, they got you out by 5, right? Because the business model of healthcare, right, requires them to get you taken care of and out of the hospital, right? So they don't have that capacity taken away. So for us in the housing space, when you're talking about the importance of habitat work, the business model of the healthcare industry now requires that people have recuperative care outside of the hospital, right? Those hospitals cannot survive without the ability to send you home very quickly, and even to some extent to monitor your care at home. So this is not just a luxury to have a home. This is the place where a lot of us are receiving care, right? That is the new business model for healthcare. And we ought to be talking to our colleagues and collaborators in the healthcare space in that way. And then I'll also say, just in terms of innovation, think about the power of our homes in terms of how much investments we're making. I mean, think about, even for those technologists that I shared at the very beginning, think about how much innovation, or all of those technology companies, they didn't start in some big corporate space. Bill Gates and, all the rest of these folks, whoever, right, the new technologists, whoever they all are, Elon Musk and all the other folks, they didn't start their companies in some big corporate space. All of them started where? Right? Where'd they start? You all tell me.
In the basement. At home.
Exactly. In their basements, in their garages, tinkering around. And guess what? They're not the only one. It's the Freakonomics is a webcast of a university professor of behavioral economics at University of Chicago. And they estimate that Americans spend about $41 billion a year tinkering around in our basements and our garages, figuring out how to do stuff that will eventually make it back to the economic market. That's a huge amount of research and development, right? R&D costs that is taking place in our homes. The power of an address. If you have one, right, you have the seed of innovation, right? If you don't have the space to innovate, to create, to think, right, to do all the things that our economy requires. We want every American to be, right? Think about this. Our economy requires us to be constantly innovating, using our ingenuity, using our creativity to solve all kinds of problems. But if people don't have a stable place to do that, then all of those innovation dollars get lost. All of that talent and potential, all of the entrepreneurial talent and expertise and innovation, right, gets minimized or reduced because we're not making that investment. So what if you started to talk to people in your community about housing in these ways? This is not just about making sure that people have a decent place to lay their head at night. That's one opportunity. Our homes are the seat of innovation. They're the place where we receive healthcare. It's the place where we are able to social distance. It's the place where we're able to, many of us are getting our college degrees for the first time. It's the place where many of us are educating our kids. The place where we go to work now. Man, right? That's a whole different kind of conversation, right? Then we just need some, right? Then home is a decent place to live, right? So reframing that conversation powerfully so you get people to think about in those ways makes a huge difference. So take to the chat. Let me think about the additional ways you might talk about a home, right? I've certainly given you a few, but there are lots of ways. What does a home allow you to do, man? What is it, right, that makes that address, that place where you live, a home, powerful for folks? Because that's the way you get people to reimagine and think about housing in a much more constructive way. Take to the chat. Let me see what you got. Yeah. Stability, connect with the neighbors. Yeah. Yeah. Thank you, Danny. Talking about leveraging Section 8. Yeah. For home ownership component. It effectively reduced the mortgage to 8 to 10 years. So yeah, so you're giving people, right, by doing that, Danny, additional years, right, that they to pay off their mortgages, right, to open up some financial doors. Maybe that's the financing they need to start that new home business, right? To start to send their kids to college. That little bit of space that you open up in people's budgets, man, maybe they go back to school to community college and get a new certification. I don't know. Right? Mary says peace of mind. Think about this. Like, what do you do after a long day, when you've had a tough day for whatever reason and you're exhausted for whatever reason? What do you do? I know I go home, I get a glass of wine. I go home and I'm like, let me get myself together. So when I think about that, your home is the source of your mental and emotional health. Wow. What about a home as the seat of mental and emotional health? Right? To be honest, is the foundation for stability, safety, health, education, well-being. So exactly. And so Regina's a place of worship. I love it. Yes. as a PK kid, right, a preacher's kid all my life, for myself, our home was a part of our sanctuary, right, for all of the years that I was growing up. For many places, that's a place for prayer, for relaxation, for meditation, to all of that, right? Yeah, and Rob says tie it back to strength and stability and self-reliance, right? The core, think about this, the core lessons that you probably learned that were formidable for you in those formidable years in life probably happened inside of or around your home. All the life lessons, the first time, your parents called you when the street lights came on and gave you that first little, let's just call it a lesson, right? We used to call it, you got a spanking or, but they gave you that first lesson, a life lesson. You probably learned at home, right? Right. Home is the place where, for a lot of folks, they get the most important life lessons, right? That's the seed of what we're talking about. So we could belabor this. I love this. People saying privacy and also recreating the family core. Yes, right. To participate politically, all of that happens when folks are explaining to them, even just the way that your kids get answers to all the kind of, craziest questions they have, right? All of that happens in the space of our homes. And you and I have to be able to start talking about it in that way, right? It's not just, right, well, yeah, we need a home because people need a place to live, and man, it is the crux of so much more. And when you and I get really careful and thoughtful about expanding, below that up in 1,000 different ways, what happens is it allows you to tap more people as partners and collaborators. So think about the healthcare industry. If their business model requires that people have a home, you got a partner, right? Think about other businesses, right? If they think about how much investment comes out of for R&D, right? It comes out of our homes, you got a business partner, right? Think about some of these community colleges or some of these colleges like Strayer and some of the other places where they do a lot of their work virtually, yeah? And it requires that that the young adults and other folks have a place to be, right? You got a partner, right? You got potential partners in the work that you all do that you might not have had before because you've grown, right? The sense of what y'all are trying to get done. All right, I think I may go through one more, and then I may open this up for just questions and comments. I think one more can be very helpful to us, and just telling the story of us. I would say we as a species are addicted to story. Even at nighttime when you go to sleep, your mind dreams in stories. How many people wake up in the middle of the night and go, what the heck was going on in my dreams last night? What I want to say, our ability to tell a bigger story about what we're doing is really important. That, and there are many ways to tell a story of us. There's not only one, but I'll give you some examples that I've seen across the country. In Chicago, they have a whole campaign that talks about we need the people who need affordable housing, right? And this was in reaction to folks saying, we don't want affordable housing. Yes, you do, because we need the people who need this housing. They need to be here with us, you know, right? I remember I was living in a community in Columbia, Maryland, where every time it snowed even a little bit, I said, y'all don't have this problem in Kentucky. Y'all don't have this problem necessarily probably in Indiana. Because I'm from Michigan, where every time it snows, you just move the snow out of the way and you keep going. But when I was living in Maryland, it was an interesting thing. Like when the snow came down, like everybody froze. Like, oh my God, there's a snowflake! Ah! Folks in Memphis might appreciate this. But they would close down the schools, it was the most baffling thing to be a person from Michigan, where we, you know, who doesn't go to school because it's snowing? Like it could snow up to 10 inches. Like who cares? Like you move it out of the way and you go to school. So it's the most baffling thing to me. And then I remember one of the principals told me, well, I know there's not really much snow on the ground, but we close schools because most of the teachers that we have cannot afford to live in this community. And so they can't get, when there's even a little bit of snow, it takes them longer to get to schools. And so there's nobody here to open the school doors on time consistently for our kids. Huh? Like, wait a minute, we got to close the schools down because most of the folks who teach in the schools don't live they can't afford to live in the community, and so our kids are not getting what they need, right? Because we can't solve for that. So it's one of these conversations where we should never be closing down schools because nobody's there to open the school doors because they don't live in our community, right? They teach in this community, they ought to be able to live in this community. And so something like that, getting more people apprised to that conversation is one thing. In Boston, there was a whole nother example of this where they just got people all over the community to start talking about housing, from the startups. In the middle of the screen, the startups. People say, hey, we're in Massachusetts, we're building a business. We cannot operate in Boston or Massachusetts and have housing costs this high. We need affordable housing as business owners because we can't afford to pay workers here what they would require in order to be in a house. So they were saying we need affordable housing, right? There was a teacher in there. There's a professor at MIT, at one of the most prestigious universities in the country, not being able to afford homes. Somebody who's involved in the housing process, right? Andrew DeFranza said, listen, it's impossible to do this work. We really need some help in the housing space. So I want you all to think about this issue of how you get more people to start to recognize their interests in housing. One way was to reframe the conversation ways we just talked about, right? Thinking about healthcare and who's in the space. But another way is just to start highlighting everyday people who may not understand how much they need housing and need everybody in the community to be housed until you ask them to think about it or until you help them see their parts in the story. One of the communities we worked, folks put this up: who's saving your life? Well, nobody, unless we get some better housing here for EMT workers, right? And they drew the chalk outline. I'll go back to that. They drew the chalk outline of what would be an EMT worker, but for the fact that they can't pay, right, what it would require folks to be able to live there, you know, right? Who's teaching your kids? Nobody, unless we can figure out a way to get better housing here. And there's a chalk outline of what would be a teacher in that conversation. And the same thing, who's cooking your food? Nobody, right? Or very few people, but we can't figure out how to make sure that we can pay folks. And so I don't want to belabor the point. I just want to say, think about the folks who are not right now energized around this conversation and how we get them in this conversation, right? We need practice telling bigger stories of us. And I think about this COVID-19 stuff, right? getting people in this conversation. We need practice telling these stories of hope and innovation, that we're working with each other. We need each other. Like, how do we tell those kind of stories? So take to the chat. Tell me who you're trying to get in this conversation. Who in your community needs to see themselves inside of this housing conversation and may not be connecting to it the way that they might otherwise connect to it? Who needs to be in your storytelling? You tell me. Take to the chat. Yeah, Rob says, who's delivering? Yes, Rob. Who's delivering those packages? Lots of us are on Amazon and all these other, the online packages. Who's delivering those packages? Yeah. They need to have, right, a decent place to live, not just because, they're not just at the most basic level of having a basic needs met, but because of all the reasons we talked about before. Seat of innovation, right? Having a decent place for mental health, right? Being able to receive health care, right? Being able to recover, recuperate, home health care workers, right? All of those things. Who else needs to be part of your story? Let me see those folks. Who else should be part of it? You tell me. Yes, those who are providing childcare. Absolutely. Absolutely. Teaching assistants, all essential workers. Yeah. And I want you all now to give me some of the folks who need to see themselves in this conversation who may not yet see themselves in it. So let's go after the hard folks. I'm the president of a university. Am I in that conversation? I'm the president of a major corporation in Indiana. I'm the major president of, you all tell me. I'm heading the United Way, and I got my own problems, right? I am the head of the teachers union. I'm the head of the law enforcement, right, officers. Do I have a stake in your success? Do I have a stake in this? And I'm actually going to stop this share because I really want us to practice that now. And I would say for this conversation, I want people even to be able to come off mute. Let's have that conversation now. But this part of the sort of workshop today is really about, what do you say to these folks who may not ordinarily see themselves as part of this conversation unless they hear you begin to talk about it, right? So I want to hear some of that. And I'm happy to give some examples, but I think probably you all have many of those. And walk me through it, right? Let's practice that a little bit.
Dr. T, this is Mary, and I believe that Kentucky is coming up on having a special legislative session outside of our regular one, and there were some wins in this past session, which just ended sort of the end of March, 1st of April, with child education, kindergarten, some health care, some legislation for people coming out of incarceration, things like that. But within all the mix of that, there was not a concrete, focused discussion or mention of housing. But I will tell you something, and I am bad at this, and I have been bad. This is what happens when you begin to speak to me. My mind goes crazy, and it goes all over the place because I'm doing that wrong still. I'm doing that wrong still. But we always talk about the cost of housing. But I think with these adaptive sort of reasons and issues, we need to be talking more about those to our elected officials. They always see it, here we're coming, we're asking for money. Yes, it takes money, but what are the consequences if we don't do that? And maybe we've got to a bit flip that discussion. There won't be people getting educated, being healthy, being able to feed themselves with nutritional food. We won't be able to have, our teachers and our healthcare workers and our firemen and our police women and men living in our neighborhoods, so the community gets to know them, gets to know those people, that they can trust them. I just thank you very much. Thank you very, very much for your message today for me. It speaks volumes.
Thank you, Mary. Yeah, I think that's right, Mary. What I would say is just so step one, to start that process, there are lots of things you can do, But just to have clarity, like, speak to people's aspirations. So if you're talking to policymakers, and they have, again, policymakers are in a tough spot. I just, God bless them, honestly, because they're dealing with some serious tough issues right now they're absolutely just, you can't solve all the problems in the world, but they get all the problems in the world. So one of the things I would say is, for policymakers, if you're speaking to policymakers about this issue, what are the main issues that they are trying to solve for? Some of them are personal, some of them are related to the issues that are out there. Speak to both those things, right? So the personal issues, and every legislator, policymaker wants to be seen as an innovator, a pioneer, right? So speak to that, legislator, whatever, Roberts, Jackson, whoever it is. I know you're an innovator, right? I know that you do this work because you genuinely care about the community. I know that the reason that you ran and got this office because you, and give their words back to them, the last speech they gave where they talked about caring about the community. I know you do this work because of, right, your own personal story about, coming back as a veteran and that's why you care about this issue. Great. That's the personal story. That's their personal aspiration to be seen in that way. And then a professional way, you've been asked to solve a great many challenges. Well, here's what I'm here to tell you. An investment in housing, a smart investment in housing will help you solve a great many challenges, right? You want to keep people safe during the pandemic, you got to have housing. You got to invest in people's ability to do that. You want to make sure our schools are educating our kids in a really thoughtful way. You're getting parents asking you about that. So do we. Housing helps you get there. You want to make sure that we have a healthier environment, like one of your platform issues might have been the environment. Absolutely. When people live closer to home, guess what? They're not on the road driving those crazy gas guzzling cars, smoking up our environment. And so we get a chance to redirect, right, some of those climate change, right, to address some of those climate change issues by an investment in housing. So anything that legislator gives you as their concern, you talk about the ways that housing helps them to address that. That's connecting to people's aspirations. And I do this all the time when I'm talking to like child welfare workers, for example, and they're concerned about what's happening to our kids. Our kids are in a very precarious state right now. I don't know how many of you have been even before the pandemic started to happen, our kids in this country really in not great shape. But part of it may be social media and the impacts of that. But the suicide rates among our children are growing across this country exponentially. We've never seen so many kids killing themselves. We call it deaths of despair. Something's wrong in a nation where so many kids who've never even had the chance to fall in love and, be crazy, are killing themselves. Something's wrong with that, right? Mary says child abuse is a pandemic, and these childcare workers are exhausted because they don't have the resources, right? There's not enough foster homes. We know that. They're trying to find a way to help, and they are exhausted. And so guess what one of your best allies are? Child welfare workers. The number one thing that prevents parents who've had their kids taken away for some reason from being reunited with those kids, the lack of housing, because they have to go back to a judge and say that they've been able to find an appropriate place to live or safe place to live or a place that they can afford. And if they can't do that, they cannot be reunited with their kids. So here's what happens. We as taxpayers end up paying a foster care family to take care of somebody's kids while the parents of those kids, right, who cannot afford to get a house, can't get their kids. And so our money is going toward the foster when the actual parents actually want their kids back. Makes no sense at all, but that's a dynamic we've created. And so what childcare workers across the country want you to know as housers, if you solve the housing situation, about a third of our caseload is gone, right? Just wiped off the books, right? Help us with that. So guess what one of your major stakeholders is? Collaborators. Folks in child, you got a whole army, right, in your own of child welfare workers who are saying, if we could solve that, wow, right? My gosh, this. Housing, when we think about it, can help us to solve so many issues, but we have to powerfully make that case. Y'all get that? Yeah?
we need to recognize more of our partners and engage them, don't we?
Absolutely. I mean, think about this. I'll give you another example. Law enforcement. You wouldn't think that law enforcement would be your strongest partners, but think about how many law enforcement officers are now involved in the very unfortunate exercise of evicting people from their homes. Evictions in all our communities has risen dramatically over the last 10 to 15 years. Lots of folks are now talking about what to do about evictions. We have about 30 million Americans right now facing eviction. We don't know how we're going to resolve that or solve it, or what we're going to do about that. Think about how debilitating it is for a law enforcement officer to preside over that every single day. You got folks, mostly in the sheriff's offices, have to go out with the landlords and put people out of their homes and put them out in the street. Literally take their stuff out and just dump it in the street. Then the families come, the families are crying, the kids are crying. I mean, just the emotional toll that takes on you as a law enforcement officer. And I can guarantee you nobody gets into law enforcement today to put people out of their homes, right? But because we have not solved this issue of housing, we're putting a lot of our law enforcement folks in a position where they have to be the ones to manage a whole part of the housing challenge, debacle, that is not even what they're trained to do. Nobody goes to law enforcement because they want to put people out, right? Nobody. And yet, millions of law enforcement officers across this country every day have to stand over and watch people get put out of their homes. Guess what? Law enforcement could be a strong partner with you all. Say, hey, they're like, we don't want to do this. This is not our job. It's not our role. Let's solve this housing issue so I can do the business of the work that I've actually trained to do as a law enforcement officer, not be involved in putting people out of their doors. So I want y'all to think, I want you all really to think strategically, really, and get out of your comfort zone, right? Get out of your comfort zone. And folks that you never thought would be your allies, I want you to be radically inclusive. Who else needs to be talking about? Who else is a strong partner that we haven't thought about? That, man, if we get them energized, what an enormous opportunity there is to collaborate. Yeah. Thoughts, ideas?
This is great. I think you're inspiring us to think big, get a bigger partnership, address more issues. Boy, there are a lot of little pieces that we need to put together, but I'm excited about, I always like doing big, going and doing crazy things. So I think this is right up our alley. We need to be thinking about how do we have a bigger impact, because there's so many people that need help, and there are a lot of people that are going to help us if we engage them properly. So
you got it. And here's the thing, y'all are so uniquely positioned in the space. When Habitat pulls up to the table on these issues, nobody assumes like an ulterior motive. Nobody puts you all in a partisan box. They don't, right? They recognize the brand of Habitat, and they recognize you as doing fantastic work. They're bringing people together, right? There are lots of other organizations that can, that may try and do some of the same kind of work that people don't perceive in quite the same kind of way. But you all have a brand that says we bring people together across difference. Man, who better do that work than Habitat? I mean, right?
all right.
So any other thoughts or questions or ideas about who y'all might engage?
Dr. T, this is Adrian Bush. I'm the director of the Homeless and Housing Coalition of Kentucky. And I think we have done a good job in our organization of doing cross-sector policy work, particularly with tying housing and healthcare outcomes together. Housing and legal justice, economic security, that sort of thing. Over the past year, we have intentionally worked with reentry groups, and with the idea that We want to reduce the barriers people face post incarceration, including criminal background checks, felony convictions, stuff like that. One space that we haven't really worked in much is the child welfare space. And I do think, I cannot speak for the other states, I am a Kentuckian, but I think here in Kentucky, our child welfare system is out of control. It has been out of control. And I do think with this coming out of the pandemic, with the unprecedented amount of federal money coming to Kentucky, there is interest in the child welfare space of figuring out how we can do this work together, because the outcomes really do impact each other. When I was in Eastern Kentucky years ago, we had a small apartment complex, and basically any family who had a relationship with Child Protective Services, that was the reason they were in our housing. Like there might be neglect issues, but there really wasn't that much malicious abuse or anything. It was a substandard housing issue. So anyway, the Annie Casey state partner group had asked us to present just this morning on ways that they can help with housing and homelessness as child advocates. So we will continue to do that cross-sector policy work. And I think the more people do that in their local communities, other chapters, other advocates, I think the better. The other thing too, somebody had mentioned in the chat, talking to local officials, counties and cities are also getting an unprecedented amount of money through the American Rescue Plan Act. And it would be a good investment for them to, get some of that money to housing developers to really increase the housing infrastructure in local communities.
I think that's right. And I just want to say a number of things. So I think you're right. So hats off to you, Adrian, for sort of recognizing that there is this real opportunity, even in the child welfare space, to be lockstep as with a strong partner. And that when you all create those kind of partnerships, there is additional resources that can support your work. So even philanthropic resources. Casey Foundation is one that we work with quite a lot, and their network across the country. But there's a lot of philanthropic dollars that are now flowing into cross-sector partnerships. So when they see groups, especially that are non-traditional groups, asking for philanthropic funds like Habitat, who are making bridges, right, to these other sectors in ways that are new and different, foundations love that. So to an extent that, you want to be able to tap into some of those funds, there is a real opportunity to position your work in that category of things. And I would encourage you to do that because that's a really powerful place for y'all to work. Again, you are bridge builders, right? And you recognize that. And when you talk to foundations about the kind of innovative bridge building that you are doing, right, they're very interested in that. So I would encourage you to do that and continue to go in that direction. I also wanted to acknowledge that Catherine has something in the chat, which I love. I hadn't thought about this, but you're absolutely right. She says all the hotels and businesses that are meant for tourists, right? In many cities across the country, where I live in Orlando, Florida, all of the, touristy hotels have been repositioned for folks who are, have been evicted of their homes or who were homeless, and they just want to get people off the street during the pandemic. And so, like a lot of places, now the conversation is, well, we house people during the pandemic. You cannot possibly think you're going to put all these folks back out on the street. And so there's this thing, like, well, okay, so where all of those kind of issues have come up. But I love the idea, Catherine, of trying to figure out, what's the opportunity for engaging those hotels that were meant for tourists, many of which have been repositioned for folks who were formerly homeless, but also just generally speaking, like, is there a way to engage them in this conversation? And I don't know, maybe there are other kind of opportunities, but I love the idea of thinking really big, Lyle, to your point, about who else should be in this conversation. Like, who else has a vested interest in our work, but who may not think about it in that way. They may not know yet until we kind of talk to them about like how much the work that they're doing is directly related to our work. And I know even some of the folks at the Memphis Habitat, we were talking about a month or so ago about the aging in place work that they do in Memphis, which is fantastic. You know, we were just talking about in that conversation with them about who else, right, who needs to understand the value of the work that you all do. And once they get that value, like you know, health insurers and others can see that value that they get out of you all working to help people age in place. Right? There's a huge opportunity there to tap into that, the health insurers, because it saves them money, right, to have Habitat do that work, and also helps seniors, right, do what they want to do, which is to stay and age in place. So I just, you know, again, I want you, when you leave our session today, I want you to be thinking about sort of what I call radical inclusion, right? Who do we include in this conversation? Everybody. I mean, I was doing this work in LA, and folks started, and because of where LA is, we started talking about like, you know, the motion picture industry, which hires a lot of folks at all levels of the industry, and they haven't really thought much about how you get, you know, obviously the screen actors, right, who get the big money, right, get paid lots of money, but there are thousands of people in LA who don't have the big jobs, who work the sets, who bring the lights, who, you know, prepare the set, who do wardrobe and styling and all the stuff that makes that industry possible, right? Why aren't they in this conversation? What is their interest and stake in it? How do we get them to understand that the industry is dependent largely on our ability to make sure that people have decent housing? If you're in Ohio, who are your major employers, right? Who are those folks? What's their stake in it? Hospitals, business. I mean, like, and then how do we make that case? And to the extent that you're able to do that, man, you just grow the impact of your work and the folks who want to support it, because now they see their interest in what y'all are working on. Anybody else have other ideas? Thinking big.
And feel free to take off you can unmute anytime at this point. I think it's kind of fun just to speak up. You don't have to put on your camera if you don't want to, but if you want to, but Kurt, if you want to say something, if you have your camera on, you can jump right in.
Exactly. Look at all those faces. Hey,
Rob, I think it's fun when people put on their camera. Rob Locke runs our affiliate in Louisville. He's got a lot of stuff going on.
Hey there.
Feel free to speak up.
I'm not sure what specifically to speak to. Obviously, the thread around considering how affordable housing impacts more our entire community is, you know, what I'm taking away. I love wrote down that Martin Luther King quote early, that, you know, we've got to figure out how to live together as brothers or perish together as fools. Phenomenal. I mean, I am personally struggling. I've got calls set up with some of our Metro Council leaders. One Friday with Jessica Green, who's, you know, I think who's generally a supporter, and I think it'll be an easy call. But I have some other folks that I don't know well, and some that are polarizing the conversation around affordable housing and our Affordable Housing Trust Fund, and who are coming to the conversation locally, trying to polarize the allocation of those funds towards 30% very median income or less. And so opening that conversation back up to where we can hear each other around, you know, those Metro Council folks that are complaining that not enough of the funds are being used to help very low income families. I want to hear, but we've got to have a conversation with each other. And so that quote of, hey, you know, we've got to work together on this stuff is really relevant to me as I prepare to, try to get a meeting with Shakori Arthur. I don't know if any of the Louisville people have a relationship with him, but he's been pretty, you know, vocal in the space around, you know, that the funds shouldn't be going to families who are earning 60% of area median income, which is insane. We all are, from my perspective, I talk about the power of home a lot. And so that aligns a lot with, you know, the power of an address. And I think about Habitat's work, and particularly home, be it home ownership or home in general, is fixing the broken rung of a ladder to climb to a better place. And you know, I believe that. I've spent my entire career at Habitat. I've seen it transform lives, and I think it affects all of us. And when we polarize the conversation and start blaming people, which is what I feel like is going on in the space right now, I tend to want to shut down. I tend to want to not enter that conversation because I got work to do. I mean, I'll own it. I'm multitasking on 3 different things while I'm doing on this call. So, but I know that one of the things I have to do as a leader is to be willing to enter that conversation and enter it with confidence that, you know, we've got to work together as brothers or perish together as fools. So that's kind of a monologue. So sorry about that, but that's where I am right now in terms of helping share the conversation about affordable housing across the spectrum.
Yeah, I love everything you said. That was perfect. And what I would say is what you're looking at, what we're seeing across the country is, I would say, the fraying of the social fabric of communities. And it's happening for a lot of reasons. Some would blame technology, some would blame politics, whatever, the smaller influence of houses of worship. I mean, any number of things could probably be it. But we're watching the disintegration of a strong sense of we, right? A strong sense of our collective power. So folks are retreating to their own, some people call it tribalism. We're retreating to our own sort of tribe of folks, right? Well, these are my folks, I'm gonna protect what they get, and these are your folks. And so now we're arguing with each other, right? Not about how all of us get better and get what we need, but about whether I get what I need and you get what you need in this conversation. And so that's what we're facing. And that's also, I think, again, a part of the power of organizations who are working on the sort of what I call civic muscle, right? The civic muscle of collective power. And what you're describing is that, like, hey folks, we don't need to be in a circular firing squad. We're all, at the end of the day, what we care about is something that's bigger for community. And so I would say, even in terms of the way you talk to folks, that reminding people of that sense of that we together, either we work together or we're all done for it, is really important. And what I would say to that is, I see in the space, I work all across the country at all levels of the housing market, right? I work with some of the nation's housing finance agencies and, realtors and the planning departments. I mean, literally at all phases of the housing space, nationally and in local communities. And one of the things that I've been watching over the last probably 3 years is the splintering of the housing sector for many years, right? Because we got so little attention, right? We were all kind of in the same boat. Nobody was really getting attention. Now, with some more of these funds that are coming down the pike, I think there is a splintering that is related to that. Well, not just for funding, but also just the severity of what's happening has pushed us into this moment that I think is very dangerous for the housing sector, right? It's very dangerous. Like, I watch, on one hand, the folks who are getting really energized around issues of racial justice feel very disconnected from the folks who are looking at housing from the vantage point of low-income families and saying things that are not in alignment. And I'm going, wait a minute, we are, that work is aligned. Don't splinter the field. I'll give an example. In terms of that issue, there are lots of folks, particularly I think in the racial justice movement, who are talking about this movement around cancel rent. You just have to cancel it. There are just millions of people who cannot afford to pay rent. They cannot afford to pay their mortgages. It is unacceptable for us to be expecting people who don't have a way. There is no way right now for lots of folks to be employed. You can't expect folks to be able to pay rent, so just cancel it. And there's that faction. But then there are other folks. If you look at the majority of affordable housing in this country is created through organizations like Habitat, or organizations like nonprofit developers who rely on all kinds of tax credits, like the low-income housing tax credit. They own and maintain a lot of that quote-unquote affordable housing. And so if you start talking about cancel rent, the first, right, landlords that are going to go under are all these folks who do affordable housing. It's like, wait a minute, I'm like, so this policy, which is bubbling up from folks' frustration about cancel rent, is about to demolish, right, right? The majority of folks who are actively advocating for affordable housing, it's like, don't do that, right? So I think, you know, Rob, what you're saying is that kind of like circular flying squad, like, wait a minute, right? Don't let's not make decisions that are going to make it harder for us to do this work. Let's figure out how to do it easier. And so I don't think there's one solution to it. I think that this conversation about how we build a stronger sense of we around this, hey, listen, folks, we are actually better off working together than the sort of go it alone strategies that pit us against each other, especially now that we're getting some attention from policymakers to address these issues of housing. Does that make sense?
I really like the image of the circular firing squad, and we'll probably steal it. And I like your comment about the power of we. One of my tagline, when anybody asks me why I continue to do the work at Habitat, it's seeing God's spirit in action. But in particular, when we show up at the beginning of the day as you and me, but we end the day as us and we. And so it goes all the way back to your early comments about bringing people together. It's my favorite part of the work we do.
That's right. That's right.
Cool.
Could I respond to that in Rob's scenario a little bit? I don't live in Louisville, so I'm not pretending that like I have expertise about Metro Council dynamics. I just know what I read and what I hear from, you know, impacted folks and people who are inboxing me because they got an eviction notice from their landlord and stuff like that. And I think Councilman Arthur's point that not enough of the housing trust fund locally has been directed to 30% area median income is well-founded. But the reason for that is because that trust fund has never been sufficiently supported. So I think if you can like agree with that with him, which I think you do, Rob, right? Okay. I mean, if you start from there, then, and you talk about, okay, then what are our strategies to get enough funding from Louisville Metro to adequately support the housing trust fund so that we can actually do enough for extremely low income, for the 50%. You know, I think that our problem with local housing trust funds, and we only have 2 in Kentucky, is just that they've never been adequately funded. So.
And I would encourage you to think about, in terms of how do we talk about this with policymakers, is listen, folks, we need a diverse mix of housing in every community across the state of Kentucky, period. Every community ought to have some diversity. We ought to have high income homes that people who have a lot of income can afford, and we ought to have places where middle income can afford, and we ought to have places where low income or even folks who have no income, right, can afford to live in this community. We want to be a community that can hold on to the diversity of people in our country. Like every community should have that. So the question for us is not to figure out like that this one versus that one is, let's look at the range we got and look at where the needs are and figure out like, okay, for folks who have, you know, 0 to 30% of AMI, what's the funding mechanism for that? How are we getting that done? For folks that are, you know, 30 to 60, or sometimes they'll do 30 to 80% of AMI. What's the funding source? What is that? What are the gaps there? And what are we looking at? And then even folks with the high income, like we got folks who are moving in who have a lot of income and they want, great, wonderful. We need those folks too. Then with, you know, the market will take care of those folks because they got income, right? Okay, if that's the case, then have at it. But position this as an entire pipeline. We care about everybody in the space, right? And then what are the strategies at each level? And as long as people have got a strategy across the spectrum, great. But what you can't do is tell us that this is what you can't do is we're only going to do this and this, and we don't care about anybody else. That's not an appropriate strategy, right? Like, so think about it in that way. How are we making sure that we have a diverse mix across this community? And if that's the way that people approach it, I think you're much better off. Now, it doesn't get you completely around. We want to put more money here, and right, you still have to figure out the amounts in different proportions, but helping people see the entire range is often helpful. One, because they see themselves as part of that bigger we. We're all a part of the same spectrum, whether you're high income or the low income or some of the middle, we're all in the same space. We all need a decent place to live in this community. The question is, how are we making that possible? What's the engine that powers, right, folks at all levels of income across this community? All right. And folks at all levels of income, like everybody should be able to afford a decent place to live in our community, no exceptions, period, right? No exceptions, right? And so what does it look like when we take that stance, right? We may not be able to house everybody in Kentucky in one particular community, but everybody across the spectrum should be able to find something, right, in every community across, like, you know, we should have enough, right, for every single, no exceptions. Nobody's left out of this. And if we can't say that that's the truth, then we need to step back and figure out how we get there. So listen, folks, this is not easy. Nobody said it was easy, but what I'm glad that y'all are grappling with is how do we get these folks, number one, to the table who may not have seen themselves as part of this conversation, and the complexity of the moment we're in, which is there's not a strong sense of we, and that we have to build it. We have to create that sense that we're in this together. Otherwise, we perish as fools, right?
Well, this has been a good discussion. Thank you.
Yeah.
Anybody else have any other questions or inspirations they'd like to share with us?
Dr. T, this is Kelly Asher over at the Homeless and Housing Coalition Kentucky. I know that my mic may cut in and out, and I apologize for that. I'm still troubleshooting as to why that's happening.
No worries.
One of the things when I first started working here was working with law enforcement and partnering with them, because they do interact with folks who are homeless a lot. They end up becoming de facto outreach folks. But the challenges that I've seen in that it have been numerous, and especially as of recently, as I've tried to work with them, at least, and this is from me and this is from my perspective, I've had a really hard time helping them make that connection. And then there are times where I feel that I'm spending all of this effort saying, look, this is going to make your job easier. We work together. It's going to make the community safer. And then later on, I feel like there's not any reciprocation. And I've sort of just kind of given up engaging with them on that front. And I've changed in roles as well, and that has played a part in it. But the feeling was already there when I changed roles, and it continues to be there. And so I guess my question is, how do you know? Is there a point in time where you say, okay, I have tried with these folks a lot, I'm not getting anywhere. Do I need to go and work with someone else and collaborate with someone else and just maybe come back to it? Or how do I problem solve around that? And how do I know when it makes sense to exit the conversation versus like I don't want to come across as challenging the idea. I just my brain's going in all different directions, but I think I
think Kelly, you're absolutely right. And so in the policy space, we have some terminology that we often use called there's something called the policy window. So there are all kinds of policy ideas floating around about how you change the world, and sometimes policymakers are just not receptive to it. And so you gotta wait a little bit, right, until there's a policy window that opens. I would say, unfortunately, in this country, often those policy windows open because there's something negative that has happened, right? But often there's something positive. Something's happened in the environment that forces that policy window open, and if you are ready and waiting, right at that moment with the policy on hand that helps them to sort of see their way back into that conversation, and then that's exactly what happens. So I would say, as you talk to law enforcement officers, right, the benefit that they could and should be having in this issue, and they may not be ready to see themselves as part of this issue yet. That's all right, keep engaging, but just lightly. You may not spend all your time there, but keep engaging lightly whenever there's an opportunity. And then when that policy window opens, or when that window opens where there's an opportunity to engage those law enforcement officers differently, you are ready with all the materials, with all the arguments, ready to go, right? So, and then to give an example, just, you know, when 9/11 happened, there are folks who had been saying for years, you have to do something to protect our borders. It's just too easy for folks to get into the country, to fly a plane. I mean, you can do all kinds of ways. Folks from other places could do all kind of nefarious things. And, you know, we just as a nation weren't ready to kind of be that, we just weren't, not because we didn't believe that it was true or credible, that just wasn't the interest in making, you know, those security kind of to boosting our security mechanisms at our airports and ports of entry and things like that. And so lots of, you know, national security experts were literally saying, like yelling almost, saying, we want you to hear us, this is important, and they weren't getting much traction. And then 9/11 happened. And I will tell you that within, what was it, 100 days of 9/11 happened, you know, the Patriot Act, right, was on the, I mean, literally with thousands of, I mean, every single thing that every national security expert had been yelling about for the last 20 years within that thing. I don't think policymakers even read it. They didn't care. They were like, put it in there, put it in there, put it in there, right? And all of a sudden, all this stuff passed, some of which was helpful, some of which was not, but it didn't matter. The policy window was open, right, for that kind of conversation to happen. So what I would say to you is, you're certainly not waiting around for something negative to happen, but you're waiting for, you are doing the work that you can to engage now, and then also waiting for there to be that opening, that triggering event that allows you to have a different conversation. I would say to you, for you know, in many parts of the country, you know, lots of folks have been trying to have this conversation about police conduct, right, around traffic stops and things like that. Couldn't get much discussion around that. Right now, there is a robust discussion about it. In fact, you know, ask the folks in Brooklyn Center, Minnesota right now, what they're about to have a very robust conversation about. They're about to have a conversation about how we handle routine traffic stops and whether or not our procedures are right or wrong or whatever that is. All of a sudden, whoever's been trying to have that conversation is all of a sudden the first person that gets in the door, right? So I want to say, Kelly, don't be discouraged. For better or for worse, whether it's because something has happened that is not so great, maybe a law enforcement officer has a run-in with somebody who's homeless and it doesn't go well and it's on the front page of the newspaper and all of a sudden they want to have a meeting with you, or because something really positive happens, right? Community Solutions, which is an organization nationally, just got $100 million from MacArthur Foundation to do some work in communities across the country. And I do believe some of that money is headed for Kentucky. Maybe it's because some of that money comes in and allows, you know, a lot of folks who do homelessness work across the state to do some really powerful stuff. And some of those law enforcement officers went in on that, right? Maybe there's something positive that happens and they say, okay, maybe what, so don't wait, kind of continue to make sure that you are engaging folks, but be ready, because believe me, that policy window that you're waiting for will open, and your job is to be ready, right? The first one, right, ready to go, right, when that does happen. Does that make sense?
Yes,
Yep.
absolutely. And it challenges a lot of the perspectives that I have, which is always something that I welcome. Thank you so much.
You know, I think about it as I'm a mom, and sometimes, you know, as a mom, I have teenagers. You see your teenagers do just, you know, make all the mistakes that you've already made in life. And, you know, it's what you would love to be able to just say to your teenagers, don't do that. You're going to be very unhappy with that, you know, but you can't. Like, teenagers are going to do what they're going to do. You just have to be there when the thing kind of, when what you would normally say was going to happen, happened. And sometimes your teenagers go out and they do the thing you know is not the thing to do. And you go, you know, I tell my teenagers and they go and do it anyway. And I said, going out and doing something that they, you know, not, you know, whatever, playing a video game or whatever it is. And I'm thinking in my head, oh, my love, listen to your mother. Eventually you are going to come back to me, right? Putting your head on my shoulder saying, Mom, I should have listened to you. And yeah. And it's the same way with some of these organizations that I think you're talking about, Kelly, that you're trying to create alliances with. And you're like, oh boy, you don't know this yet, but you need me. And eventually we're going to have this conversation. So, you know, right? It's one of those kind of moments where you don't know this yet, but we are going to dance.
Well, Dr. T, this has been really inspiring. A lot of fun, some great questions answered, and I think you've motivated us all to look into the future and see what we might do to build more partnerships, stronger partnerships, bring in more people.
Yes.
And we all know we need to find ways to address this issue in better ways. And so this has been super. I think we told people we'd wrap up about 1, so we probably ought to do that. But any final thoughts or words?
Well, I would just say, really, I'm going to start where I started, which is just talking about what I see. And one of the reasons I work so hard with the Habitat affiliates across the country is because I really do see that you all have a very unique perspective and a unique value proposition across the country on the issue of housing. And so to the extent that you're leaning into that, it's not just about our ability to create housing solutions, but our ability to bring people together, right, that no other, right, that no other group in the housing space can bring together in a way that is thoughtful and constructive is really important. So if you're leaning into that value proposition, that gives you a part of what you need to bring those collaborations together. So
To quote Judy Mashburn, amen. Never give up. As a mother, grandmother, grandfather on my side, never give up, keep after it. We appreciate it. You got a lot of nice comments out of there. You gotta make sure you look at those before we sign off here.
That's right.
This has been a good message. Thank you to all of the folks who made this happen. And Mary Shearer, thank you for all you did to pull this together.